This video is brought to you by Game Maker. Stick around to the end to find out more. There's an interesting discussion happening right now in the game space regarding the price of Hollow Knight Silksong and how it may affect the larger games industry. The game released on September 4th for the surprisingly low cost of $20, and has since gone on to sell over 5 million copies in its first week. Silksong had a big impact on the industry, not only as one of the biggest indie releases of all time, but also on how it prompted other developers in its orbit to react. A number of games, such as Starbirds, Clover Pit, and Devolver Digital's highly anticipated Baby Steps, moved the release dates to avoid being overshadowed by Silksong. It's important to remember that developers aren't just fighting for sales at release for their games, but coverage from the press and streamers as well. When a game with as much hype behind it as Silksong comes around, it pretty much dominates both the coverage and sales spheres for a while. This is something that Atari may have learned the hard way with their own Metroidvania, Adventure of Samsara, which debuted to fewer than 1,000 copies sold on Steam according to Video Games Chronicle. Would it have fared better if it wasn't placed next to Silksong? My gut says no, as I've seen virtually no hype about it online, but that's the risk you take launching next to a behemoth. As a note here, before we really get going on this topic, we're going to show some developer takes that you may highly disagree with. But remember that these are just opinions of people also trying to make it in the game space, and this is not an invitation to go express your feelings towards them in an aggressive way. I've seen a lot of chatter amongst folks in the industry worried that Silksong will have an impact on people's expectations for what games should be priced. I've also seen takes that suggest Team Cherry should have been more mindful about how they released the game to try not to bury other indies in their orbit. I think anyone working in game, whether they're a developer or not, should be careful not to overreact to Silksong's impact on the industry, however. These discussions aren't new, either. When a game blows up like Silksong, or Baldur's Gate 3, or this year's Expedition 33, there's always some sort of discussion about how it's going to affect the industry both positively and negatively. The founder of Hinterland Studios, the developers of The Long Dark, thought similarly, saying on Blue Sky, "Indie devs, there's nothing for you to learn about the success or launch of Silksong. Do not try to extrapolate from extreme outliers and then think you can follow some predetermined formula for success. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist for that team the first time around either. Stop it." Personally, and this is more coming from a consumer perspective than a media or business perspective, I don't think Silksong's price is as big a deal as many in the industry are making it out to be. Silksong was a guaranteed success. It was easily the most hyped, independently developed game of all time. The previous game had sold over 15 million copies, and I'm sure a massive amount of people will, or already have, purchased Silksong out of the fear of missing out alone. Whether Silksong was $20, $30, or even $40, this game was going to sell massively. It didn't need press coverage, it didn't need user reviews, and it didn't need any streamers to sell. The game had essentially become a meme within the gaming community, with pretty much every Showcases chat repeating the question of whether or not Silksong would be shown. And when it wasn't, the clown noses would come out. There aren't many games out there, save for maybe Call of Duty and the Grand Theft Auto series, that don't need introductions to sell. In the independent space, one of the only games I can think of that might have the same type of reaction would be the next game from Stardew Valley maker Concerned Ape, Haunted Chocolatier. These are anomalies in the gaming space, and they won't really have an impact on my thinking as a consumer when it comes to purchasing other video games. I tend to think that generally, if someone is extremely excited or interested in the game, the price doesn't have too much sway on whether or not they're going to purchase it. That's more of an emotionally driven decision than it is a financial one. If that same person is maybe interested in a game, but not frothing at the mouth to get it, then yeah, the entry price is going to be more of a deciding factor for them. They're taking a flyer on a game that they ultimately may not enjoy, so there's more of a risk in parting with their money. Time, I'm sure, is also a factor for many when it comes to purchasing a game they're not already emotionally invested in. When Yahtzee and I were figuring out the pricing for Starstruck Vagabond, for example, we had to take a lot of different factors into consideration. How much work Yahtzee put into the title, ultimately, wasn't as important as what we thought players would willingly pay for it. We knew there would be some people who would buy the game simply because it was made by Yahtzee. We knew there was another section of the audience that had been keeping an eye on the game from when Yahtzee was making Dev Diary episodes about it. And then, of course, there was a general audience who would just stumble upon the game on Steam. Pricing a game is ultimately about what the developer thinks is right and what they believe the audience will pay for it. As Hinterland's founder said, value is subjective to the player looking to buy your game, and there's no point in using an extreme outlier like Hollow Knight Silksong to try to chart your own success. You don't need to look any further than other similar successful games in the Metroidvania genre to know this. Nine Souls was one of last year's indie darlings, and it was priced at $29.99. Animal Well is $24.99. Dead Cells, $24.99. Blasphemous, $24.99. Team Cherry has the luxury of pricing their game for less because of how successful their original game was, and the immense popularity surrounding Silksong. But that hasn't, and clearly won't stop other great Metroidvania titles from being successful because they're priced a little bit higher. Game developers are a relatively tight-knit community. The indie space in particular is very supportive of one another. They share resources, highlight each other's projects, and even sometimes partner with one another on experimental projects like the massively successful Peak. That said, sometimes I think developers and people in the industry in general forget they're in competition with one another at every step of the way. They're competing for players' attention and money. They're competing for the attention of the press and influencers. And they're competing for recognition within the industry. While of course developers want to see each other do well, I think it's a little naive to believe that just because a studio is successful, they have an obligation to be thinking about how that success will affect others in the market. Would the world be a better place if that was the case? Absolutely. But I just don't think it's realistic for developers to plan the release of their own games with other developers' well-being in mind. At the end of the day, it's business. Before I wrap this video up, I think it's important to note that the reactionary cycle has had its day with this story. A few developers' takes do not represent the industry at large, and so often, these types of stories become extremely charged rods of misinformation and bile for the people who make their name from sensationalizing things. Hollow Knight Silksong being priced at $20 is a good thing for consumers. Developers across the board are also celebrating the achievements of Team Cherry. That doesn't mean we can't also have discussions about how a monumental release like Silksong will impact the industry going forward, even if it's just a few small indie teams trying to decide how to best compete and price their games appropriately.
This video is brought to you by GameMaker. And if you've ever wanted to get into game development, GameMaker does this really crazy thing where it's free. Just start making and only pay when you want to release your game to the world commercially.
It's fast, it's user-friendly, and there's easy-to-follow tutorials, plus a dedicated community to help answer even my questions. How make man jump? GameMaker is a 2D game engine that's helped bring some of yours and my favorite recent experiences to life, like UFO 50, Chicory, Anton Blast, and of course, Yahtzee's own Starstruck Vagabond.
Ooh, we talking about GameMaker? I love that program, it's so easy to use. As well as Starstruck Vagabond, I also used it to make all 12 projects in my 12 games in 12 months Dev Diary challenge. And I couldn't believe how much sex I got out of that. None. I got none at all. Which I couldn't believe.
So what are you waiting for? Head on over to the GameMaker link in the description and start cracking away today, because we want to play your game.
Yeah, looking through this list, I'm seeing one of you made Armpit Fart Tycoon, and I've got several questions for you.